Welcome to part 10 in this series of videos where we look at Blazor WebAssembly from a beginner's perspective. We've almost finished the project, but we can make a few changes that will improve the app. We can make it visually more appealing. We can make it consistent for the user so that each form looks and behaves more or less the same. We can also make it consistent from the code point of view, and here I'm thinking of naming conventions. We've got some redundant code that we can remove. And lastly, we can stop the user losing unsaved edits accidentally. And this is the reference to navigation lock. We've all done it. We've all entered some data on a website and either got distracted or want to look up some other data and have either clicked the back button or the close button to the browser, and we've lost our precious data that we've just entered. With the advent of .NET 7, we can now prevent the user from navigating away from a page where they've got some partially entered data, and we'll be looking at that. But we'll start by looking at the visually appealing aspect of things and the consistent use. So let's have a look at the application. I've entered some extra data, so we've got some more data to play with. But for example, if we look at the countries and cities page, you'll see that we've got a horizontal bar across above the grid. Whereas if we look at the country list, we haven't. So maybe we ought to make that more consistent. On the cities, if I select a country, we'll see that the population has got 3 decimal places. I spotted this about 5 videos ago and I still haven't corrected it, so we can correct that. The other thing I'm not sure about on this page is the width of the grid. The name of the city is rather remote from the population, and maybe we ought to make the grid more compact. We've also got the height of the grid here, which we set at 200 pixels. Compare that with the country list, where we have no limitation and it just scrolls off the bottom of the page. And we've got different scrolling behaviors here. So when I scroll off the country list, the toolbar at the top of the grid disappears. On the country list, on the other hand, I can't really scroll off the bottom of the list unless I make the whole web browser a lot smaller. A few other inconsistencies. On the countries and cities, I can sort by the city name or the population, whereas on the country list I can't sort at all. On the countries and cities I can resize these columns, so if I choose to click in one of these I can resize it. Again, on the country one I can't. If we try editing a city, for example, the dialog box can be moved around, it's draggable. On the other hand, if we try and edit a country, we find that the dialog can't be moved, it's not draggable. So again, we ought to have some consistency with that, even though I'm taking a different approach with country and we're going to a different route and we're effectively blanking out the background, but I think we should still be consistent here. One last thing to do with country is that we try adding a new one. We've got no data validation here, so I can save it and we end up with an error. So we need to tackle that as well. So those are the things we need to tackle. So let's make a start. Most of these are going to be relatively simple and trivial, but we'll just make these small changes. It's going to make a big difference to the end product. The first item I want to tackle is that both the countries and cities data grids are the full width of the screen. By default, Blazor installs and uses Bootstrap for styling. Bootstrap splits the width of the screen into 12 columns. And by wrapping the data grids in a div with a particular class, the data grids can be forced to only extend, say, 9 columns, i.e. 3/4 of the screen width. So we'll start off by looking at index razor, and we've already got a div surrounding the Syncfusion grid. So by putting in this code, I can make that grid only extend across 9 of the 12 columns. So let's do the same again for the countries, the country list page, where we haven't got a div at the moment, so let's put one in. And we'll need to put a closing div in at the bottom here. And if we now run it, we should see that the grids only extend 3/4 of the way across the screen, which they do. One could perhaps continue to adjust this to suit one's needs, but I think that looks a little bit better. Right, back to the code. We've also got on the index page this HR tag, which puts the horizontal row. So we'll have the same on the country list, and we'll have it underneath the title here. And a quick refresh gives us our horizontal row across there. Now for those pesky decimal places. That's actually extremely easy to fix. So we can do that by coming in here and looking at the index page, and we'll see that we've got the format for the city population as just N. If we change that to N0, that will get rid of the decimal places. I've also got the height of the grid for the cities as 200. Let me just change that to 600 for a moment, and we'll see what the effect of that is. If I refresh and now look at the cities, we'll see that the cities is now more or less the height of the screen as I've got it. But there's still a problem with this. If I reduce the size of the screen a little, I now end up with 2 scroll bars. A scroll bar within the grid and a scroll bar outside the grid, and if I change the size sufficiently, I will end up with not being able to see the top of the grid at all. So I can't get to the toolbar. This took quite a bit of playing around with to get to work. And the solution I found was that we can put some additional code in here that will limit the height of the grid. And the way it'll limit the height is to calculate the height of the, let's go back. It'll calculate the height of the what's known as the viewport, which is effectively the browser size, and then we can subtract the height of the headings here and here. Now this just was plain trial and error on my part to get the heights of these correct, but this is what I found. I found that if I change that to this, so we've got the class equals col sm9 as before, but I've said the style, the height, is a calculation, and it's 100 presumably % of the viewport height minus 12 rem. That could be in rem or it could be in pixels, it doesn't really matter. But the other thing you need to do is change that to be 100%. And with those changes in place, we can now get the grids to look in proportion. So let me refresh and select a country again. And now I've got the scroll bar entirely within the grid, regardless of what size I make the screen. I don't get that scroll bar appearing on the right hand side. I need to apply it to this, of course. So let me copy that, and we'll put it on the countries one. But on the countries one, we've got a slight difference. We don't need the height of the drop-down box for the country. And again, by trial and error, I discovered that 5 rem was about the right size. So let's just go back to the countries and refresh it. And that's still not correct, is it? And I suddenly realise why. It's because I've forgotten to add. It's because I've forgotten to add the height in here. So let's go back to the index, and I need height equals 100%. And also, while I'm about it, I'm going to have allowing sorting and resizing of the grid as well. Right, one more go. It looks as if my calculations weren't quite right, or my guesses, so I think that should be 10 rem. And now we've got the scroll bars contained within the grid itself, and we don't have any outside the grid. So no matter what size I have that, it is now behaving properly. The other thing I wanted to do for cities was to put a total at the bottom of the grid showing what the total population is. And we can do that very simply. It's quite a lot of code, but it's relatively straightforward. So let's put that in. So on the index page, we need at the bottom here, under grid columns, this. So quite a lot of code, but it's merely nesting of grid aggregates, which columns you're wanting, and the templates and so on. But again, let's run it and see what happens. So countries and cities, select a country, and we've now got the population at the bottom. On the country list, I know I'm jumping around a bit here, but I don't think the country ID really makes any sense here. It would make much more sense just to have the country name and to have it sorted by country name in the first place. So let's remove the country ID and change it so that we get sorted by the country name. So on country list, we want to get rid of this column with the country ID. And we need to make a small change to the refresh countries grid so that it sorts it. And this is a technique we've used before, but let me just replace this. So we're going to do exactly as we've done before, but we've introduced a new variable called countries unordered, which will set the initial get countries to, and then we'll order them. So we need to put in a declaration up there for that. So I'll copy that. And we've got rid of our red squigglies. Let's see if it's working. And now we've got the countries appearing in country name. If we wanted them in reverse order, we could simply click on the heading. So I believe that we've now got our 2 main pages behaving identically. But on the country list page, if we try adding a country, the heading, the dialog isn't draggable, and we haven't got the validation on the country. And we need to make changes for that. And it's on the countries add edit. This is our Syncfusion dialog, and to make it draggable, we need to basically change it so we've got a header section and a content section, and we need to make it allow dragging. So I'm going to copy what should be here and paste over the top. So we've now got allow dragging, and we've got our header and content, and I've also added our hidden submit button so that we don't have problems when the user hits the carriage return or return key instead of clicking save. We also want to make some changes to data validation for the country, and we can do that on the country model file. And what we want to do is make the country name required, and we want it to be limited to, say, 50 characters. And being lazy, I can just copy the code from city and paste it onto country and amend. So a country name is required, and the name must be between 2 and 50 characters. But we also need the validation and data annotations in here. So we need the data annotation after the edit form. And we need the error message to appear where we want it, so we'll have it underneath the Syncfusion text box for the country name. Which will be this. So just validation message for country name. And again, that should be it. So let's run it just to check. Add a new country, and I can drag it. Actually, there's little point, but because we're not hiding anything under here, but we may as well have it behaving the same anyway. And if I try saving it, it says the country name is required. If I come out, go back in, and hit carriage return, again, I get the error message. And if I put a new country in and hit carriage return, it saves it. And there it is. So that all seems to be working as we want it to be. Now, because we started off with the standard Blazor template, we've got some redundant code in here that we don't need. So I'm just going to go and delete that redundant code. We don't need the counter page, so we can go in here and just delete it. We don't need the fetch data page. We don't want the survey prompt, which is down here. We don't need the weather forecast controller. Or the weather forecast model class. So that should have got rid of the gross duplications. But when looking through the city controller, it appears that I got a couple of methods which we created but were not used. So in the city controller, We've got get cities, which we don't use at all. And we don't use get cities by ID either. So I'll get rid of that. In practice, I know these aren't needed, but one might be more cautious in a different situation and choose to comment them out to start with. I'll need to get rid of that city service as well. Get cities and get cities by ID. And of course the same in the interface. And it was while I was doing this, I realized again I was inconsistent in my naming conventions. In City Controller, City Service and iCity Service, I'd named methods for counting cities according to the intended procedure, i.e. count cities for insert, whereas for countries, I'd name them according to the parameters, e.g. count countries by name and ID. So if I look at the country service, I've got count countries by name and count countries by name and ID. Whereas for cities, I've got count cities for insert and count cities for edit. Either of these would be suitable, but I think they should be at least consistent. So I'm going to change the count countries version so it says count countries for insert and count countries for edit. So this is the count countries by name, and now I'm going to change that to count countries for insert. And I can use the Control F find and replace, and I'm going to select replace with count insert. I want to match the case, and I want to match whole words only, and then I think we're safe to go and replace them all in the entire solution. For occurrences, that sounds about right. And now we want to replace that with this. Let's run it to see that just check that it works. It was the countries one that I changed, so let's just check that I can't add one called Austria again. And I can't. And if I choose to edit one, so that says Brazil, for example, I can't do that. So that all seems to have worked. In some ways, I've saved the best bit till last. With .NET 7, it's now possible to prevent a user from navigating away from a data edit page and losing their edits. We've all done it at some stage. We've been entering some information and maybe we wanted to look something up. We've navigated away from the page and we've lost our data entry. Let's have a look at how this can happen at the moment. So let's select Iraq. Let's say we want to edit it and change it to Iran. I won't save or cancel it, but if I click the refresh page, we will lose the edit. It was Iran, now it's gone back to Iraq. If I change it again, and this time I click the back button, it closes the dialog and we've lost the data, so it's now Iraq. We can do something more dramatic. If we select edit and then enter a different address in the browser bar, let's just change that to Iran, we will also lose the edit. So let me change it to something else completely. And we've lost the edit. We could do something even more dramatic. If we were editing a page, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. We could actually close the browser. And again we would lose the edit. Before moving on, it might be worth mentioning that there are two types of navigation in this context. We can either navigate internally, so by refreshing the page, for example, we're still at localhost 2078, or we can navigate back using the back button, and again it's still the local host, or we can navigate away completely, such as by closing the browser. The ones where we navigate internally, for example refreshing the page or back button, that's an internal navigation. If we move away from our website completely by closing the browser or going to a different website, that's called external. Now, to prevent this, we need to do just a couple of things. If we have a look at the index page first, we need to do two things. First of all, we need to inject the IJS runtime, and we now need to insert the new navigation lock. And you need to be careful where you put this. Since we want to stop navigation from within the dialog, we need to put this within the dialog tags. So it just simply says navigation lock, confirm external navigation, and I've closed the tag. To start with, I had this outside the dialog and I got all sorts of unexpected behavior. Notice here that all we're doing is preventing or confirming external navigation. So let's run it with this parameter. We've made the changes to the index page, but I'm just briefly going to visit the country list and then back to countries and cities. And I'm going to select a country and edit a city. And let's change the population to, say, 46,000. And before saving it, I'm going to try and leave the site completely. And the most dramatic way of doing that is to close the browser. And now I'm given the option to leave or to cancel. So that's external. I could move internally, and for example, because I visited the country list first, I click the back button to go back to the country list. And if I did that, I do so. I lose the edit. And that's because that's an internal change and we haven't done anything about that. So let's look at how we can do that. This is relatively simple. All we need to do is to change this navigation lock tag so that we've now got on before internal navigation, and if that happens we want to call a new method called confirm leave page, and I'll add that to the end of the code, and it's one I've got prepared earlier, and it simply says confirm that I want to leave. So it's calling this the JS runtime, and it'll say, are you sure you want to leave? And if confirmed, if it's not confirmed, it'll prevent navigation. Let's try this out. So I'm going to start by visiting country list. So I've got something to go back to countries and cities, select something to edit, change the population, and now I'm going to try going back, and it'll say, are you sure you want to leave? And I'll say cancel. I could try refreshing the page, and it'll tell me they're not going to be saved, or I can try closing the page completely, and again I'm given the option to cancel. So that seems to be okay here. There is a small problem though with country list, and that is if we try editing a country, when we click cancel, we're actually just navigating back to country list. So if I do that again, you'll see we've moved to Countries Add Edit. That's the page we need to put the navigation lock on. But if I save it, I'm still navigating back to Country List. Let me show you what I mean. So on Countries Add Edit, we'll need to inject the JS runtime. And we'll need to add something to the dialog to prevent navigation. And I'll use the same code that we used for the index page. So let's try that. So I select country list, select country, try edit. I'll try leaving externally. I'm not allowed to without giving permission. But now, if I select cancel, it says, are you sure I want to leave? Maybe that's a perfectly valid thing. Maybe I do want to leave. I suppose I could select OK. But let me say I want to change it and then click save. I get the same message. Are we sure I want to leave? And that's because it's trying to go back to the countries list. So let me cancel that and say OK. And you'll see here we're navigating back to country list. So what we want here is to say that if we are going back to countries list, we want to allow it anyway. And after a bit of investigation, this is what I've come up with. So it's basically the same, but I'm saying if the context.target location does not equal country list, we want to ask the question and, if necessary, prevent navigation. But if we are going back to our country list page, we're not going to do the test. So one last test on this. I go to country list. Let's try editing it. Just test all probabilities. So it won't allow me to leave the page. But now if I click cancel, I'm not asked, do I want to leave it? It says that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. If I try editing and then saving, that is okay. However, if I try editing and then go to an external page, and I'm going to put this link in the description. This is the YouTube video where Steve Sanderson explains this. So let me see if I find the link for that. If I try browsing to Steve Sanderson's YouTube, it says, leave site, changes won't be made. And I'm going to say leave on this occasion. And then we'll go to Steve Sanderson's site, which explains location changing and navigation log. I have already spotted some mistakes in this, but I'm going to restrain myself from making those very minor corrections. And I'm sure there are other changes that could be made to improve the appearance and functionality of this WebAssembly application. That pretty much concludes this series of videos. And I suppose I ought to ask myself, what do I think about Blazor WebAssembly as opposed to Blazor Server? And the answer is, I don't really know. It seems more complicated than Blazor Server, but I can see that it might have wider application for much larger applications than I'm likely to build. And I'm therefore going to be sitting on the fence as to whether I go Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor Server. On the other hand, there's Blazor, I think it's called United, coming along shortly, so maybe I won't need to make that decision. We'll need to leave that for another day. Thank you very much for watching this series, and I will be producing other YouTube videos. I'm not quite sure on what yet, but keep an eye open. Thank you very much.